Swifters, this is Prof G, and I hope you're ready to continue your quest to become ladies and lords of the SwiftUI layout, because in this lesson we're going to tackle the divider view. We'll learn how to improve on what Apple gives us with divider by using a rectangle shape. We'll learn how to use the geometry reader to get a device's dimensions so we can set a view to a relative size, not a fixed size. And we'll learn some techniques to get color to bleed in the top and bottom safe area. iOS royalty awaits, Your Excellency, so let's learn big. If you're new here, welcome. You might want to check out the course playlist to see how we got here. So here's where we were at the last lesson. We have a text view with a fixed frame size in the middle of the VStack. Press the awesome button and you see the text, you are awesome. Press the great button and you see the text, you are great. Now I'll show you another view that you might find useful when designing your user interface. That's the divider view. And that can add a thin line either horizontally or vertically. So let's add one before the H stack, and since we're inside of a V stack or vertical stack, this will add a horizontal line. Now notice code completion, it says a visual element that can be used to separate other content. And why don't you down arrow and make sure that you select the version with the open and close parens. That doesn't have a description, but that's the view we want. And when we press return, we see a faint gray line before our H stack where our buttons are. It's a very subtle design element. Now by default, this line fills up the available space, but you could do things like add padding. So if we do a dot padding modifier afterward, we pull in the sides of the horizontal line by the default value on either side, and the divider moves up because there's padding on all sides. Now if you add a divider to an H stack, you get a vertical divider. And just to show this, I'll add a new divider after the spacer between the two buttons in the H stack. Now remember, the spacer is going to move horizontally, but since we've got a divider in an H stack, that's going to create a vertical divider, and that actually almost acts like a spacer too. You can see that this pushes the view up so that it's a lot larger. Now you can also add padding with this divider like we did before. That'll add a little bit of vertical padding. And so now we know about vertical dividers. I'm actually going to delete this divider, but why don't we go back and take a look at some of the options for the horizontal divider we added above. So I'm going to Control Option click on divider to bring up the attributes inspector. We see one of the attributes is frame, so if I wanted to have a specific width for my divider, I could change the width here. So why don't we change it to 150? And even though you can enter a height value, that's not going to change the height of the line itself. And we take a look over at the right-hand side, we have a very thin divider that's 150 points wide. Now if you find the gray divider is too subtle, you can add a color to the divider. And to do that, we won't use foreground color like we did before. Instead, we use background, not background color, but that still accepts a color. But you don't want to do what I first did here, which is add a black background after the frame. That turns the entire frame black. So remember, modifier order matters, but I'm just going to move my background modifier up till just after the divider, and that thin black divider is easier to see. If I comment out the background modifier, you can notice the difference. Now you can also draw custom shapes and use those as dividers as well. And SwiftUI has a bunch of views that we can use to draw different shapes. We'll use rectangle. Now we've also used rounded rectangle, but this one is just a rectangle. I'll enter that right between my divider and my H stack, so capital R rectangle, open and close parens afterward. This draws a rectangle. You see it's a black rectangle that fills up the available space. If I want to change the color, I can use a dot fill modifier. This accepts a color, so why don't we make the color dot indigo? That's a nice subtle blue. And then if you want to change the dimensions of the rectangle, if you think about, how might we do this? Oh, we already learned we could use the dot frame modifier. So if we put dot frame underneath, WIHE will add the width and height parameter when we press return. Let's set the width to 175, and we'll set the height to 4. And we get a much thicker divider. We can change the height down to 1. We get a thinner divider. So lots of flexibility using shapes. You can create your own dividers using them. That's looking good. Well, right now the divider is a fixed size, and it's going to remain that size even if our app runs on a larger device like an iPad. So I'll switch to the iPad now. The divider and rectangle are the same width, but they look much smaller on the bigger iPad. Remember, if you need to adjust the device view, you can use the zoom buttons in the lower right corner. But if we want the dimension to scale according to the available width, for example, to be 1/3 the width of a device, or maybe just half the width of the device, well, to do this, we need to get the width of the device. And how do we do that? Well, in SwiftUI, we have a view called the Geometry Reader. Now, just about everything in SwiftUI is considered a view, and Geometry Reader is a view too. But it doesn't display things on screen. It just provides us with access to size and the coordinates of the view that's enclosed inside of it. Now this might be more clear with a demonstration, so follow along. Now to get the dimensions of our device, we want to get the dimensions of our outermost view. And in our app, the outermost view is this VStack. So we'll surround the VStack in a geometry reader. So I'll make space above the VStack and enter Geometry Reader with a capital G, capital R. Select this option with content. Unfortunately, code completion doesn't have a description. Now press return, we enter Geometry Reader, then we can press return on the content input, and when we do that we usually get trailing closure, but this is an unusual trailing closure format. You see we have this value geometry proxy that looks like it's an input and then it says in. Well, when we see a closure with a value and in, that means that the statement that this is associated with is passing special data into the closure that we can use. Here, the geometry reader is passing in a geometry proxy object, and a geometry proxy provides information about a view's geometry, its dimensions, its size, its position, so we can use this geometry proxy to find out information about the width of the view. Totally useful because the width is going to be different on different size devices. Now the fact that this is an input means it wants us to give a name that it will use as a constant below. It's essentially saying, what do you want to call the data that I'm passing into you? Most developers call this geometry, some might call it geo or g. I like geometry, so we'll use that. So now let's use this geometry variable. And before we can do that, we're going to put all of our VStack code inside the geometry reader. I'm just going to code fold the VStack, then cut it out with Command X, and then paste it in between the curlies of the geometry reader with a Command V. Now, since the geometry is at the top level, the geometry value that we're passing in is going to give us the dimensions of the device. Then we can use that to set a frame width according to the dimensions of the view. We'll go down here into the rectangle's frame modifier, and I want to change the fixed width value of 175, and I'm going to use the geometry value to calculate a size relative to the size of whatever encloses the VStack, and that's the size of the device. Now when I start to type in lowercase geometry, code completion says this is a value of type geometry proxy. See that after the colon here? And that type actually has several components that we can get at using code completion. So let's do that. Press return to enter geometry. After geometry, I'll type a dot. We see sizes in there as an option, and code completion says the size of the container view. That's what we want, so select this. Then another dot, and we can see that the size value will give us access to width or height. I want width here, so select that. And if we want to set the width of this frame to 2/3 of the geometry width, then I just multiply this by 2/3. Multiplication in Swift is just like you'll see in other programming languages or in spreadsheets like Excel. It's the star or asterisk character. And I'm multiplying this by 2/3, so that's 2/3. And look at that! The line is now 2/3 the width of the device. I can change the 2/3 to 0.5 to make a line half the width of the device, or 1/3 to make the line 1/3 of the device. I'll go back to 2/3, but look what happens when we go back to the flagship iPhone. The line is 2/3 the width of this much smaller device, so we've learned how we can use a geometry reader to get a device's dimensions and use the dimension to set a relative frame size, in this case the frame width, instead of using a fixed frame width. Nice! So now we know dividers and how to use a rectangle to mimic a divider. I'm going to delete those. And I'm going to remove the geometry reader that surrounds our VStack. Make sure you also delete its closing curly. And I'll make sure that our indentation lines up with Command A to select all and Control I to fix the indents. Looking good. Now one more thing I want to show you in this lesson. Sometimes you want to have a safe area in one color, but the rest of your app in another color. Here's an example. We actually have a text view up top with a frame that spans the width of our device, and that background color also bleeds into the top safe area. It's a nice look, and this bottom indigo color also bleeds into the bottom safe area. Now if we look at this iPhone over here with a rectangular screen, there's no bottom safe area, so we don't see any indigo on the bottom, but on this iPad, it also has a top and a bottom safe area, so we've got indigo in there. Now creating this isn't super intuitive, but I'll show you one way to do it. And before I start, I'm just going to delete these border values that I've commented out. Those were from the previous lesson. We don't need those anymore. And now as the first view in the VStack, let's create a text view passing in the string awesome, and we'll set .font to .large title, .font weight to .black, and .background to .indigo. Now let's make this font white, so just after font weight I'll say .foreground style, passing in .white. And I'd like a little bit of padding in here, so just before the .background indigo, I'm going to say .padding, passing in nothing between the parens, and that's looking good. Now this text view has the width that's just the length of the string inside of it, plus some padding. Can you guess how we might push the width of this view out to the edges? We can use a .frame modifier. Let's put one in just underneath padding. We'll say .frame, and this time we're going to pass in max width. So I'll type in MAXW, press return, and inside here we're going to pass in .infinity. That pushes the width of this frame out as far as it can go, so it'll touch the edges. Always remember that modifier order matters, so if we had our background before the frame, the background wouldn't be pushed out to the edges. We want to make sure that we apply the background to the frame, so the frame's got to go first. Well, this looks good. Now how can we get a color to bleed into this bottom safe area? Well, it's a little tricky, but we're going to apply the same principles. When this text view was touching the safe area, it bled into the safe area. Well, what we're going to do down below is we're going to create a view that bleeds into the bottom safe area. The trick is we're going to create a view. We'll use a shape of a rectangle that has no height. But because we set this no height rectangle's background to indigo, it'll bleed into the bottom safe area and turn that indigo. Let's code this together so you conquer yet another technique. So down below the H stack and before the closing curly in the V stack, I'm going to enter a capital R rectangle with open and closed parens. And that bad boy is vast and black. It takes up the whole space available. Now watch this. If I say dot background and between parens set the background to dot indigo, we see our bottom safe area is indigo. So the background of the rectangle bled right into the bottom safe area. Cool. But how do we get rid of the rectangle? Well, friends, above the background, let's create a dot frame, and we'll pass in height, HE, press return, and we're going to pass in a height of 0. And look at that. That gives us a stealthy, invisible rectangle, but it's got a background of indigo, and it's touching the bottom safe area, so it turns the bottom safe area indigo. Let's click on the device options, this icon that looks like some toggles, and see how this thing would look in dark mode. And in dark mode, we see that the app itself turns dark, but we preserve the colors that are in our safe areas. Looking good. Let's turn that back to light mode, and let's see how this would look on an iPhone with a rectangular screen. And here we go. Those iPhones don't have a bottom safe area, so we don't see a bottom safe area down here, just as expected. How would it look in an iPad? And we see the iPad does have safe areas at the top and the bottom. That's looking good. We see indigo bordering the top and bottom as well. Let's go back to our flagship iPhone, and Swifter, you conquered a bunch more useful layout skills. We worked with the divider view, creating horizontal and vertical dividers, and we adjusted the size of a divider using the frame modifier and changed the divider's color with the background modifier. We learned SwiftUI makes it easy to work with shapes, and we used a rectangle to mimic a divider with even more customization, setting the rectangle's color with dot fill and adjusting the rectangle size with dot frame. We also learned how to use the geometry reader to read a view's dimensions, and we set the rectangle divider to a multiple of the relative width of a view instead of a fixed width. We also learned how we could set the color of the safe area so that it looks different from the rest of our app. So hopefully after our last few lessons, you're feeling like dukes and duchesses of design, and you've got quite a bit of control over how your app looks. Keep hacking, skilled one.